What's up, kings and queens? It's your boy Dan from Daft Previews, and we did it. We hit 4K subscribers, so thank you all for your continuous support. Now, if it is your first time watching this channel, I do this every single day, and what I do is I preview all the key matchups, all the key players. We talk about their props, their lines, their form, their matchup. I tell you what's good. I tell you what isn't. And I do all this to give you all the information that you need to make informed and educated decision on NBA player props. So I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. It's only a slightly little bit different, but I've been reading the comments. I'm going to look more into three-point shooting props for three-point shooters, and I'm going to look into more block props or stock props for a lot of these defensive players. So this might get a little bit lengthy, but I know you guys are going to appreciate it. So let's jump into it. Let's go. All right, we're starting things off with the Orlando Magic versus the Charlotte Hornets. Markelle Fultz, Nick Richards, game time decisions in this game, but we still have a lot of props to get through. So starting with the Orlando Magic, looking at Jalen Suggs. Now his points props at 10.5. His matchup isn't the best, but he has hit this in 7 out of his last 10 games. Against the Hornets, he has covered in 2 consecutive games now, scoring 15 and 12 points. He does shoot a fair few three-pointers, so let's have a look at this. His line for three-pointers is 1.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10, but he has a great matchup when it comes to three-point shooting. The Charlotte Hornets do give up a lot of threes, although Jalen Suggs has only covered in 1 of his last 3 games against the Hornets, did make 2 three-pointers the last time that they played. Outside of that, ain't nobody betting on assist and rebound props for Jalen Suggs, so we move ahead. Gary Harris, he's in the starting lineup, but his line's only at 7.5. More than capable of covering this line. Check that out. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 and in 5 consecutive games. Against the Hornets, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. His last game, he went under, only scored 5 points in 25 minutes. Looking at his last 5 games, he's averaging about 25.8 minutes. So right on his average there. Look, I'd lean to the over given how well he's hit this as of late. The matchup isn't the best, though. But, the matchup is difficult, to be honest. But it's not the worst play in the books, is all I'm going to say. I'm jumping into Franz Wagner. His points prop here is 18.5. He has an excellent matchup against the Hornets, who allow the 3rd most points to small forwards. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10. Scored 30 points the last time these guys played, but has only covered in 2 out of his last 5 games against them. Jumping into his assist prop, the line is at 3.5. He's hit this in 7 of his last 10 games, and he does have a great matchup. The Hornets allow the most assists to small forwards. Franz has only covered this in 1 of 5 games against the Hornets, though. So the matchup is great. His recent form is pretty good, but he's always struggled against the Hornets when it comes to getting those assists. Looking at his rebound prop, it is at 5.5. It's plus money. He's hit this in 4 out of his last 10 and 3 out of his last 5 against the Hornets. So Franz does have a good matchup in this one, but there's nothing on there that I'm really liking. Jumping into Paolo Banchero. His points prop is at 20.5. The matchup is not difficult nor hard, but he's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, has scored 29 points in 2 consecutive games now. And in head-to-head matchups, he's covered this in 4 consecutive games against the Hornets. So seems to relish the matchup. Looking at his assist prop, it's 5.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. He was in great form getting assists over his last 5. It's really started to slow down. He's hit this at a 50% rate against the Hornets, covering 2 out of his last 4. His rebound prop is at 7.5 for plus money. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. He's gone over in 2 in a row. And against the Hornets, he's covered in 2 of his last 4, but he's gone under in his last 2 games. Wendell Carter Jr. The last time I previewed an Orlando Magic game, I said, Wendell Carter Jr. ain't doing what he used to do, so I don't like it, and I bet on Mo Wagner instead. Wendell Carter absolutely killed the Pistons, 19 points. I think he got a few rebounds as well, and Mo Wagner sucked. So Wendell Carter, his line's at 11.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. He's got an excellent matchup against the Hornets in this one. And he's covered in 4 consecutive games against the Charlotte Hornets. So I'm a fool for doubting Wendell Carter Jr. Looking at his rebound prop, that line's at 8.5. He's covered in 2 out of his last 10, but he does have a good matchup here. But he's only hit in 2 of his last 4 against the Hornets, but it was the last 2 games against them. Looking at the dates of these games, though, they were last season. So Wendell Carter Jr., not playing at the same level as he once was. His lines are a little bit higher because the matchup is a good one, but it's crazy how we've gone through every player in the Orlando Magic starting lineup, and I haven't really liked anything. So I think there's value to be had. It could be in Jalen Suggs because of his recent form. Could be Gary Harris as well, but it could also be someone like Cole Anthony or Mo Wagner off the bench. Jumping into these Hornets, though, we'll start with Trey Mann. His points props at 12.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. He does have a somewhat difficult matchup against Orlando. Looking at his assist prop, lines at 4.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. The matchup is difficult for that. And his rebound prop is also at 4.5, which is covered in 4 out of his last 10. And he has a difficult matchup there too. So, Trey Mann, I'm not feeling you today, my man. Looking at Brandon Miller. So this is a home game. So I'd be expecting Brandon Miller to play somewhat better. He does play better at home. I know that for sure. His line in this game is at 18.5. The matchup isn't the most difficult one for the Charlotte Hornets. 3 out of his last 10 games, he's covered this line. And against the Magic, he did score 20 points against the last time. And that was on the road as well. And looking at his assist prop, it's 2.5. Ain't nobody fucking around with Brandon Miller assists. So let me move straight into rebounds. The line's at 4.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10 games. Had 5 rebounds last time against the Orlando Magic. He is a 3-point shooter. Well, he takes a lot of threes, that's for sure. His line in this one is 2.5. It is plus money, and he's covered this in 4 out of his last 10. He scored 20 points against the Magic last time, but he only hit 2 3-pointers against them. So I don't mind Brandon Miller's points prop in this game. I'm going to write that down as a lead for me to research a little bit more. But out of all his props, I'd say the points prop probably has my interest the most, even though he is a 3-point shooter. I'm definitely leaning on the side of points there. What do I like? His volume, last 2 games, 21 plus attempts, 2 consecutive games, a lot of 3-pointers. I don't care if his percentage is low, but if he's going to take over 20 shots, I reckon he can score at least 18.5 points. So Brandon Miller points, I don't mind that. Miles Bridges, his points props at 21.5. He's got a difficult matchup in this one. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10 games. He did score 23 points against the Orlando Magic last time. Jumping into his assist prop, 3.5, 5 of his last 10. Tough matchup, only had 2 last time. I have been betting on his rebounds for a couple of games now. He's covered in 7 of his last 10. His line's at 8.5. You can get that for plus money. The matchup is a somewhat difficult one, though. He has had 10 rebounds the last time these guys played. So I don't mind that, but I think there'll be better players out on the book. But his recent form is good. The matchup is difficult, but he's had 10 rebounds against them in the past. So if I had to make a Bridges play, it would definitely be on the rebound side of thing for Miles Bridges. Outside of that, nothing I'm absolutely loving in this game. So let's get into the next one. It's the Detroit Pistons versus the Miami Heat. And in this particular game, Quentin Grimes for the Pistons is a game time decision. Tyler Hero, Kevin Love, Josh Richardson all out for the Miami Heat. We do only have lines for Bam and Jimmy at the moment, though. So we have to wait closer to game time to get more action on some other players. But let's start with those two. Kicking it off with Bam Adebayo. His points prop is 21.5. He does have a good matchup against the Pistons here. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games, and he's covered in 2 out of his last 4 against the Detroit Pistons. So he's only played them once this year, but this was in October where he did score 22 points. So if I had to, I'd bet on the over for this one, but have to dive in a little bit further. Looking at his assist prop, the line's at 4.5. He's covered in 2 of his last 10. He's only in 1 of 4 games against the Pistons, but he does have a good matchup, but you're getting plus money for that play. And his rebound props at 10.5. He has been on a bit of a downturn over the last 5 games, failing to cover in each game. The matchup is not a hard one, but he's gone under in his last 3 games against the Pistons as well. So if we had to play Bam, if we absolutely had to, it would definitely be on the point side of things, especially with no Tyler Hero. They may be lacking some scoring options, perhaps. Jimmy Butler is playing, though, and if you're new to basketball, Jimmy Butler comes alive after the All-Star break, and he's been balling ever since that break occurred. His points prop in this game is 22.5. He's covered that in 6 out of his last 10 games. He has a great matchup, and against the Pistons, he's covered this in 2 out of his last 3. Only scored 19 points the last time they matched up. I shot poorly, 6 for 18 in that game. So Jimmy Butler, if you look at his recent form, he actually doesn't shoot the ball that much. He's scoring pretty much 20 points a game. but he takes only 13 shots, but he gets to the free throw line almost 10 times per game. So I have won a few bets on Jimmy as of late. Definitely one that I'd be considering again because his matchup's probably good for all props, and his form is pretty good for all props as well. So it could be a good PRA or a PA play. Looking at his assists, though, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. He does have a good matchup, and he's covered in 2 out of his last 3 games against the Pistons. Once again, the only game he went under was in the matchup earlier this year. His rebound prop is at 5.5. He's also covered that in 7 out of his last 10, and he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. But in that game earlier this year, he had 13 rebounds, so which is pretty massive for him. I think for this particular one for Jimmy, I'd probably lean to his PRA. He's covered his PRA in 3 consecutive games against the Pistons of 34.5, and he's covered in 8 of his last 10 games. He does have a great matchup for points and assists, but he has shown in the past that he can rebound quite well against the Detroit Pistons. I don't mind that for Jimmy Butler, looking at his PRA, but I'll get in the lab after this and research it a little bit further. Looking at these Detroit Pistons, though, start with Cade Cunningham. His line's at 20.5, so it's starting to drop off. Did see it up to 23.5, I believe, after one of these games here. Got up to 23.5. It's come back to 20.5. Matchup is a difficult one. He has covered this in 7 of his last 10, and he did score 30 points in the matchup earlier this year against the Miami Heat, so he's got it done against them before. Looking at his assist prop, the line's at 6.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10 games. The matchup's not good or bad, and he had 9 assists in that game earlier this season. Jumping into his rebound prop, we're looking at 3.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Went under in rebounds last time against the Heat, so for 3 rebounds. I think what has been the best way to bet Cade Cunningham all of this season is if you are going to bet the over, points and assists is the way to go. So he's covered in 7 out of his last 10 games. The line is at 27.5. In those games, though, in those 7 games where he did cover, he also covered his points prop too. So that could be the best way to play him. Obviously, he covered his points and his assist prop the last time he played against the Miami Heat too. I personally won't be playing Cade Cunningham, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see him go over. Next one, let's look at Jaden Ivey. His points prop is at 14.5. His matchup's not too bad. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, but he's covered in 1 of 4 games against the Miami Heat. Looking at his assist prop, it's 3.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. This game against Orlando, he had 0 assists, and I bet on him to go over 3.5. I couldn't have read that any wronger if I tried. And he's covered this in 2 of his last 4 against Miami. So I'm not feeling Jaden Ivey. Looking at Asar Thompson, and points and rebounds, probably the only ones worth it here. Points-wise, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games. He's against the Heat. He's gone under. He only had 4 points last time they played. And looking at his rebound prop, that's only at 5.5. He's covered in 3 straight, 6 out of his last 10, and he covered his rebound last time against Miami. He had 7 rebounds. So I don't mind the rebounds there for Asar Thompson, but his line, the odds are -145. That's not overly arousing. Isaiah Stewart, he's been covering this line quite well as of late. Check that out. His points props at 10.5. He's covered it in 9 out of his last 10 games. The game where he went under, he scored 10 points against the Orlando Magic. So pretty consistent running from Isaiah Stewart. He did cover the last time against Miami with 14 points, and he had 11 points as well. So look, for Isaiah Stewart to get 10.5 points at plus money, you might have my attention on this one. So let me have a look at Stewart points. I'll look into that a little bit later. But yeah, that is looking pretty good. In terms of his minutes, he's playing about 30 minutes a night. He's taking on average 10 shot attempts if you average it out, but realistic, you're looking at 8-9 per game. But he does shoot 3-pointers as well, so that helps him hit this total. His 3-point prop is at 1.5. It's plus 180 odds. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games, and he had 2 3-pointers made in the game earlier against Miami. Doesn't often get more than 2, but yeah, look at those odds. It's probably not a bad play. I'm not going to take it, but I don't mind it. Definitely, I think the points prop looks pretty cool. Sometimes when I see a points prop like that, I think, is that too good to be true? But his rebound prop in this game is at 5.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games. Somewhat difficult matchup, but he has rebounded well in the 2 games against Miami with 11 and 14 boards. So that's not too bad. You could look at a points plus rebounds for Isaiah Stewart. That's 16.5. But he's only covered that in 7 out of his last 10. So the game where he went under in points, he just happened to also go under in rebounds. So it probably wouldn't have saved you. I think the points prop is the most likely play here, is what I'll say. He only needs to make 3 to 4 shots in this, plus a couple free throws. So I don't mind that for Isaiah Stewart. And the last one is Jalen Duren. Look at his points and his rebounds in this one. Points-wise, the line's at 12.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10 games. Difficult matchup against, but he has massacred them in the last 2, 20 and 17 points. Jalen Duren's made it happen. And looking at his rebound prop, it's 10.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. The matchup isn't too bad, but he has covered in his last 2 games against Miami. The 2 games prior to that, barely any effect, but obviously his minutes are down. So his last 2 games where he's played starter minutes, he's actually rebounding quite well. So I don't mind that for Jalen Duren. Could possibly look at some same-game parlays here where we just take Jalen Duren for 10 rebounds perhaps. We might look at Cade Cunningham in an alternate line for points or assists. You could look at Jimmy Butler alternate line for his points or assists, and even Bam Adebayo as well. So quite a few options in that game. I don't mind it. The next one is the New Orleans Pelicans versus the Toronto Raptors. So this game, no game time decisions. We know that Scotty Barnes is out. Jakob Poeltl's also out. I think he broke a finger or dislocated. So expect Kelly Olynyk to get a lot more game time. But up against the Pelicans, it's not actually a bad matchup for Kelly Olynyk, so we might be able to get something juicy on him. But let's start with these Pelicans, shall we? CJ McCollum's up first. His points prop is at 17.5. He's got a difficult matchup scoring points, but he'll have a great matchup passing the ball. But the problem is he doesn't get too many assists. So he's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. Head-to-head matchups, he scored 20-plus in 2 consecutive games against the Toronto Raptors. One of those games happened to be last month. So despite the difficult matchup, CJ's got it done in the past. Looking at his assist prop, the line's at 3.5. He has covered in 4 of his last 10. Does have a good matchup, but has only covered in 1 of his last 2 against the Raptors. His rebound prop is at 4.5. 1 of 2 against the Raptors and 5 of his last 10. He does have a good matchup, but somewhat inconsistent, old CJ. This is his 3-point prop. The line here is at 2.5. He's covered this in 8 of his last 10. But the Raptors allow the second fewest 3-pointers made to point guards on the season. So, and the odds aren't great for this either. But look, I'll leave it up to you if you decide to explore that. Jumping into Brandon Ingram, his points prop here is 21.5. He's on a great 4-game stretch of 22, 24, and 34 points. Line at 21.5, 4 consecutive games, has a good matchup scoring, and he's absolutely roasted the Raptors in the past. Check that out. 36 and 41 points for Brandon Ingram. Now, I don't bet on Ingram that much at all, but I can't ignore this. So I'm going to take his name down for my list to explore a little bit later, but I don't mind that for Brandon Ingram. Looking at his assist prop, it's 5.5. The matchup's not good or bad, but check this out. 8 of his last 10 games, he's covered 5.5 assists. So that's not bad. Against the Raptors, 3 assists and 9 assists. Looking at his rebound prop, 5.5's the line. The matchup is somewhat difficult, but he's hit in 6 out of his last 10 games. And against the Raptors, he covered in 2 consecutive games. Looking at his 3-point prop now, line is at 1.5. You can get that for plus money. The Raptors do allow the 6th most 3-pointers to shooting guards on the season. Ingram's covered in 5 of his last 10. But looking at his attempts, he does average 4.8 attempts per game, but sometimes he only shoots the ball twice. So depending on how he goes, I guess. But look, against the Raptors, 5 3-pointers, and then a month ago, he made 8 3-pointers on 11 attempts against them. So the Raptors are a good matchup. Brandon Ingram doesn't necessarily have the volume on a consistent basis, but if the Raptors are going to let him take it, we could be onto something here. So Brandon Ingram 3-pointers, good matchup, has got it, absolutely nailed them in the past against this team. That might be something that we explore. Who else do we have here? Herb Jones. I just want to look at his points prop and cry about why he killed me on this one, but does have a great matchup. He has covered this in 8 of his last 10. I bet on him 2 games in a row. The second time, he absolutely killed me. He only finished on 6 points, but Brandon Ingram went crazy, so fair enough. In head-to-head matchups, he's gone under in his last 2 against the Raptors, so that's no fun. Zion Williamson, his points props at 22.5. Somewhat difficult matchup against the Raptors, you could say, but They don't have Pascal Siakam anymore. They don't have Scotty Barnes, so probably RJ Barrett will play more time at the 4. And he's not an excellent defender, and he also doesn't have the size. So Zion could have a field day here if he really wanted to, but Zion's not built like that. So 5 out of his last 10, and he's hit 1 of 2 against the Raptors. Assist-wise, 5.5. 6 out of his last 10. Matchup's not the worst, but he has gone under in his last 2 against them. And rebound-wise, line is 5.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 and 1 of his last 2 against the Raptors. Every time I see Zion's prop, I probably lean to the under. I just feel like he doesn't have that dog in him, but he has gone over 6 of his last 10. So I won't be taking that. I just don't see enough consistency out of him, to be honest. He doesn't get mentioned much at all. So let's have a look at Jonas Valanciunas. His line's at 11.5. He's got a pretty decent matchup here against the Raptors, especially considering Jakob Poeltl's not in, Kelly Olynyk's starting, so a little bit soft inside. But Jonas is covered in 5 out of his last 10 games, and against the Raptors, he's covered in 2 of his last 3. Rebound-wise, his line's at 9.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. But he has covered in 3 consecutive games against the Raptors, with 12-plus rebounds in each of those games. So, look, I'd probably lean to the over. The problem I have with Jonas is this. Sometimes he doesn't get any minutes, and I don't understand why. So, I'd be a bit hesitant to take any bets on him. Jumping into the Toronto Raptors, Emmanuel Quickly. I was kicking myself. I missed this opportunity last time. Well, I took RJ Barrett and that cashed anyway, but no Scotty Barnes meant Quickly and Barrett. They're going to have a lot more playmaking and scoring opportunities available. They both happen to play quite well, but Quickly's points prop is 20.5. He's got a tough matchup here against the Pelicans. He has covered in 5 of his last 10 games, and he only scored 8 points the last time these guys matched up a month ago. Assists is what interests me the most, but now that line is potentially too high. It's at 7.5. Check out these last 3 games. 9 assists against Dallas, 11 against the Warriors, then 11 against the Charlotte Hornets. These games are a much easier matchup, but Quickly's going to have a lot of opportunities. The odds are pretty good, but yeah, it is a difficult matchup. He had 6 assists the last time they played. He got that in only 25 minutes, though. It was a 38-point win to the New Orleans Pelicans at home in Toronto. Look, they might play a lot better here. So these 3 games were at home for the Raptors. They might be able to compete and keep it competitive, and Quickly might be able to rack up those assists. So I'm going to take down Quickly assists, and I'll research that a little bit further. 7.5 though, but it is plus money. Looking at RJ Barrett. RJ Barrett's points props at 22.5. He's covered in 4 consecutive games. He's hitting 6 out of his last 10. He has a difficult matchup in this game, though, and he's yet to verse the Pelicans as a Raptor. His assist props at 4.5. I don't mind his assist prop these days without Scotty. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games, though. Looking at his rebound prop, it's at 7.5. It is quite high. I get there's no Scotty Barnes. The matchup isn't too bad. Zion doesn't rebound well, but he's only covered in 2 out of his last 10 games in this one. 3-pointers made. His line's at 1.5. It's plus money. He's covered this in 5 consecutive games. The Pelicans give up a lot of threes to the shooting, a small forward position, not so much to the power forward position, but if we have a look at the volume here, RJ Barrett's averaging at least 4 attempts per game. More recently, he has lifted his average up to 6. And in those games, he's been shooting 50%. He's actually in this 5-game stretch where he's been playing well. He shot over 50% in every single game. So RJ Barrett at home, it could be a play there. So RJ Barrett, I do like his points plus assists, and I don't mind pointers made either. So that could be one to look out for. The dangerous thing now, I'm looking at 3-point props, is I could potentially have a lot more bets than I want to make. So I've got to be very selective what I decide on. Gary Trent Jr., he sucks. He's cost me quite a bit of money, so I'm not looking at his ass. Kelly Olynyk, but very interested to see how he goes with more minutes. So Jakob Poeltl, what we're going to do, we're going to just only look at the games that he's played without Jakob Poeltl, because Jakob Poeltl's missed some time this year anyway. Kelly Olynyk has only covered this points prop in 2 of his last 10 games without him. So he does have a pretty decent matchup for points allowed, but nothing crazy. Looking at his rebound prop, Without Jakob Poeltl, his line's at 8.5. It's plus money. Does have a good matchup, but he's only hit this in one of his last 10 games. So I wouldn't take Kelly Olynyk with any confidence there. I just wonder who's going to get these rebounds. RJ Barrett's line's quite high. I think he could probably have a big rebounding game here. So RJ Barrett PRAs. Gary Trent Jr. quickly. They probably ain't helping. Kelly Olynyk. I think it's the young guy that they have who's starting. What's his name? Agbaji or something like that. He could be up for a good rebounding game, but his props aren't available. Let's jump into the Boston Celtics versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. Now, Boston are absolutely rolling at the moment. Scary hours, but a few game time decisions you need to be aware about. Jaylen Brown, Kristaps Porzingis, game time decisions in this one. And for Cleveland, Isaac Okoro is a game time decision. Donovan Mitchell is still out, but Karis LeVert is also a game time decision as well. But Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland all playing for the Cavs. So I think this game could still be somewhat competitive, at least for the three quarters. But let's have a look at Kristaps first. Porzingis, his points prop here is at 19.5. The Cavs allow the fifth fewest points to centers on the season. He's hit this in 7 of his last 10, and he's hit this in 1 of his last 2 against the Cavs. Looking at his three-point prop, the line for this is 1.5. Woo! He's hit this in 8 of his last 10. The matchup isn't too bad in terms of three-pointers allowed. As a team, the Cavs do allow the eighth fewest three-pointers as a team, but in terms of centers, they give them up somewhat. And against the Cavaliers this season, he's had games with 2 3-pointers made and 1 3-pointer made. Looking at the volume here, he did attempt 6 3-pointers per game in the 2 games against the Cavaliers, which isn't too bad. And then if you look at his last 10 games, he's averaging at least 5 attempts per game. He's shooting 48%. So if he's going to shoot at least 5 attempts in this one at that percentage, he's covering this 2 3-pointers made, right? So yeah, that's not a bad play. I want the injury is for Kristaps. Probably the same one that's been following him around. Yeah, it's the right quadricep injury. So if he does play, I don't mind the Kristaps 3-pointers made. Odds aren't the best, but I do think that's something he's more likely to cover. So he's hit that on 61% of the season, 80% of his last 5, and 80% of his last 10. So don't mind Kristaps there. Quick look at his rebounds. Line's at 6.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10 and 1 of his last 2 against the Cavs. So nothing overly arousing going on there. Jaylen Brown, he's also the game time decision, but let's check him out. His points props at 22.5. He's covered in 4 straight. The Golden State Warriors just left him wide open in this game. He nailed a lot of 3-pointers. He does have a good matchup here against Cleveland. Small forward is the spot that they don't defend very well. And Jaylen Brown has covered this in 4 out of his last 6 games against the Cavs. We're not looking at his, we might as well. It's pretty green. 8 of his last 10 games, he's gone over 2.5 assists. The matchup isn't the worst, but check this out. He's gone over 2.5 assists in every game against the Cleveland Cavaliers. 6 consecutive games. He does have a left knee bruise, but if he does suit up the assist prop, if you're just looking at over-unders, probably a great play here, looking at his assists. If you're looking at single bets at minus 145, probably not the most arousing play, but I'll take note of that, just in case we want to build a parlay perhaps and get stupid with it. Looking at his rebounds, 5.5 is his line. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. He has a great matchup here against Cleveland, and he's hit this in 50% of games against them. So the matchup good, but I'm not overly impressed by that. Looking at his 3-point prop, the line's at 1.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, and he does have a difficult matchup here. The Cavs don't allow too many to threes, and he's hit this in 4 out of his last 6 against them, though. But at minus 140 odds, I'd expect to see better trends. Jason Tatum, points prop is 28.5. He's got a difficult matchup against the Cavs. 4 of his last 10. He's hitting 2 of his last 5 against them. So fuck you, Jason Tatum. You stress me out every single time. But looking at his assist prop, there's a lot of green going on here. Line's at 4.5, and he's covered this in 9 of his last 10 games. He does have a hard matchup, but he has covered in 3 of his last 5 against Cleveland. Into his rebound prop, that's 8.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. His matchup is difficult, but he's hit in 4 consecutive games against the Cleveland Cavaliers. So good rebounding numbers there for Jason Tatum. In terms of 3-pointers, his line's at 3.5. It's plus money. 4 out of his last 10. He's got a tough matchup, and he's only covered in 1 of his last 5. So I'd definitely be leaning to the under there. Jason Tatum 3-pointers. If I had to take an over, potentially his assists or rebounds. Actually, you can look at rebounds or assists because he's got a good matchup for 1, and I think a difficult matchup for the other. I lied. He's got a difficult matchup for both. So he's hit this in 6 out of his last 10 games, 1 out of his last 5, but he's hit this in 4 consecutive games against the Cavaliers. Rebound props obviously been nailing at home, but some of his assists have been going quite well as well. So 13.5 rebounds and assists for Jason Tatum. If his recent form here wasn't so bad, I'd probably take it, but recent form and the matchup tells me just avoid it altogether. Looking at these Cleveland Cavaliers, we'll start with Evan Mobley. His points prop here is 15.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He's got a difficult matchup. He did score 25 points the last time they played, and he's covered in 2 of his last 4 against them. Assists, you're looking at 3.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. His last 2 games have been excellent. The matchup is difficult. He's gone under his assists in every game against the Boston Celtics. But if we just look at his games without Donovan Mitchell, it gets a little bit better, but 5 out of his last 10. So I don't know, not enough for me to take. His rebound prop is at 9.5, minus 119. Last 3 games have been rebounding quite well. The matchup isn't overly difficult, and he's hitting 75% of his games against them. So 17 rebounds when they last match up, 13 rebounds prior to that. So Evan Mobley rebounds, that might be something we can get behind. Would like to see a slightly higher hit rate over his last 10 games. This is a home game for them as well. So if you wanted to get extra picky, you can jump into home games only. And Mobley's hit this in 3 out of his last 10 home games. So yeah, a little bit hesitant to bet on anything Evan Mobley related there. But if he does explode, well, I'll look like a dickhead. But I probably look like that already. Darius Garland. Looking at his points prop. 21.5. He's covered in 2 out of his last 10 games. Obviously, he's got a great matchup here. The Celtics don't defend point guards quite well. I want to look at his points prop without Donovan Mitchell, though. So he's covered in 5 of his last 10 games against Donovan Mitchell. Yet to play the Celtics without him. But in his last 5 games against the Boston Celtics, he's covered in 3 out of his last 5. So I'd probably lean to the over, but I don't love it. His assist props at 7.5. 4 out of his last 10. Somewhat difficult matchup. And he's hit in his 3 out of his last 5, but he has gone under in 2 straight games against the Celtics. His 3-point prop, you're looking at over 3. He has covered in his last 3 games, so look at that. 7 against the Bulls, 8 against the Pistons, 5 against the New York Knicks. And he does have a good matchup. The Celtics do allow a lot of 3-pointers. Looking at head-to-head matches, he's covered this in 3 out of 5. He had a push on 1 of them. So 4 out of 5 times he's hit 3 3-pointers against the Boston Celtics. He's averaging 8 attempts per game against them. In his last 5 games, you can see his last 3 games especially, 14, 12, and 8 attempts against the Knicks. So I don't mind that for Darius Garland. You probably look at the 3.5 though, right? If you take the 3.5, you're getting plus 138 odds. I know in his last 10 games hasn't been great, but the attempts in the last 3 games has really started to shoot up. He does have a good matchup here, so I don't mind that. And he's covered in 3 of his last 5. I think that's worth a play, to be honest, if we're looking at these numbers. Plus money as well. Darius Garland over 3.5 3-pointers made. Let's check that out. I'll dive into that a little bit further a bit later. But last one's for Jared Allen. His points prop here is 17.5. Matchup against the Celtics isn't the worst. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games, but he's gone under in every single game against Boston. Check that out. Woo, that's tough. His rebound prop is at 10.5. The Celtics, he's gone under in 4 straight, but in his last 10, he's covered in 3 of those games. So what I would potentially be looking at here is probably an under in Jared Allen points plus rebounds. He's gone under in 6 out of his last 10 games, but he's obviously gone under in every single game against the Boston Celtics. Just a thought. I know I get comments about like, why do you don't bet on too many unders? Unders are better. There's a better chance of them hitting, and that's true. There is. I just don't like betting on unders because they're not fun, right? And if you're gambling to not only make profit but to have fun as well, fun gets taken out of it. It becomes a very stressful game that you're in. So that's why I don't do it. But let's jump into the Atlanta Hawks versus the New York Knicks. Trae Young's still out, so is Okongwu. Jalen Brunson, a game time decision in this one, as well as Shake Milton. So we'll start with these Hawks players. Have a quick look at Sadiq Bey. We'll probably just check his points, rebounds, maybe his 3-pointers made. But His line's at 13.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10, and he does have a pretty decent matchup here against the Knicks. In a head-to-head form, he scored 16 points when they last played, struggled prior to that. Looking at his three-pointers made, the line's at 1.5. He's covered this in 8 of his last 10 games. The matchup isn't the easiest one, though. And he had made 2 3-pointers the last time they played. And his rebound props at 5.5. 5 out of his last 10 games, but he went under in all 3 games against the Knicks. So if you're looking at Sadiq Bey, probably the points props, not the worst one in the world. Let's have a look at DeJounte Murray. So tough matchup to score the ball. He's covered in 4 of his last 10 games. Head-to-head wise, he's covered in 2 of his last 6 against the Knicks. Looking at his assist prop, the line there is 8.5. It's plus money. The matchup isn't awful, but it's still on the harder side. 4 of his last 10 games, he's gone over. But against the Knicks, he has struggled in the past. Has had a big game against them, but for the most part, very inconsistent. 3-pointers made, you'd be looking at over 2. That's not overly impressive either. So, and then rebound-wise, 5.5's the line. Tough matchup. He's covered in 6 of his last 10 and only 2 of his last 6 against the Knicks. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a big game, but the numbers aren't indicating that he should, like the likelihood, given the inconsistency in his form in the past. Bogdanovic, points-wise, is 3 of his last 10, so I wasn't expecting that to be good because it's normally pretty bad, but I want to look at his 3-point prop here. His line's at 2.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10. He does have a good matchup here against the Knicks, but he's covered in 2 out of his last 5, or works in the favor there of Bogdanovic. 2 games against him this season, he made 4 3-pointers in both games. So I'd probably lean to the over the 2.5, but at minus 140, not overly aroused by it. Let's check out Jalen Johnson in this one. Points prop here, 15.5. The matchup isn't too bad. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. These 2 games against Brooklyn, they were difficult matchups. And in head-to-head matchups, he scored 18 points the last time they played 31 minutes, but 1 of his last 6. Assist-wise, the line's at 3.5. It's plus money. Difficult matchup against the Nets. Still a difficult matchup against the Knicks, but not as hard. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, and obviously he's gone under in every game against the Knicks. 3-pointers made, the line's at 1.5, but he didn't shoot many of those. And rebound-wise, line's at 8.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10 and 1 of his last 6 against the Knicks. So he's another player that I wouldn't be surprised if they have a big game. The numbers aren't going to give you a good read because he's still young. He gets better. So even the historic games against the Knicks, you can't put too much stock into that either. So let's have a quick look at Clint Capella points and boards. Line's at 9.5, 6 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup here against the Knicks. Head-to-head matches, he's covered in 3 out of his last 6. Rebound-wise, same line at 9.5, 6 out of his last 10. Tough matchup, and he's hitting 3 of 6. So that doesn't change for Clint Capella. Jumping into these Knicks, Jalen Brunson. What's wrong with you, my boy? Jalen Brunson has a left knee bruise as well. His points were up 29.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. The Hawks give up the second most points overall, and they give up the most points to point guards on the season. So Jalen Brunson, 5 of his last 10, 1 of 6 against the Atlanta Hawks, though. So a little bit hesitant there. Assists, though, 5 out of his last 10. And he had 8 last time they played the Knicks, but he's only gone over in 2 of his last 6. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes over his points and assist prop, but he is injured, so that makes me a little bit hesitant. In terms of his 3-pointers made, he doesn't take high volume of these. He can have these stretches. The matchup is a good one for 3-pointers made, but Jalen Brunson, he smoked them in the 2 games this season. 8 3-pointers made, followed by 6 3-pointers made in the 2 games against the Knicks. Looking at his attempts, see that in those 2 games, he was letting it fly. 12 and 10 assists in those games. No Trae Young, though. I wonder if the Atlanta Hawks will still give up that many. Looking at his last 10 games, you can see on the attempt side of things, he has been letting it fly. Boston, Detroit, Golden State Warriors, he's been letting that thing go. Against the Cleveland Cavs, didn't play much at all. Played less than a minute in that game. So, yeah, I think that's not a bad play, Jalen Brunson, to go over his 3-point prop. Could be something that I entertain, but I'll obviously need to research that a little bit further. Brunson, because I think his points probably can hit, but it's just a little bit too high. But his 3-pointers made, he can get that real quick, so I don't mind that for JB. Who else have we got? Dante DiVincenzo. His points prop is at 24.5. So it's a very high line. He does have a good matchup, of course. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. He's gone under every single game against the Atlanta Hawks, though. In these games, he was only playing 20 minutes, so I'm not going to bore you by looking through those numbers. His recent form is what's most important. Jumping straight into his three-pointers made, his line is at 5.5. He's covered that in 3 out of his last 10. But attempts, he's averaging 11.7 three-point attempts per game at a 40% clip. Yeah, I'm not taking that. I think that's way too high. I'd obviously lean to the under. And the next one is Josh Hart, Mr. Triple-Double. We did bet on him when he had that massive game in the last one, but I think I only bet the over in his rebounds or something, or points and rebounds, and he covered it quite easily. So his points prop is at 14.5. So it's gone up. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. Matchup's not too difficult. He's gone under in every game against the Hawks, though. But these days, look at that. He's playing more than 40 minutes every single night. It's crazy. I don't love his points prop. 14.5 seems a little bit too high for me. But assists and rebounds, we might be able to get around it. But his assist prop's at 6.5, which is crazy high. He has covered that in 2 straight, but yeah, it's quite a difficult one. And rebound-wise, his line's at 11.5. For fuck's sake, that's so high. Now, I know he's had 2 massive rebound games, right? 18 against the Warriors and then 19 against the Cavaliers. But look, the matchup's not the greatest in terms of rebounds. I just don't feel I can take that. At 8.5, I was taking it every single time. Now it's at 11.5. That shit's just wild, right? So, yeah, I'm not a fan of any Josh Hart props. So, in this particular game, I'll probably say just Brunson 3-pointers made, the only one that I would consider. So, let's jump into the next one. We are looking at the 76ers versus the Brooklyn Nets. So, having a look at who's playing, we've got Cam Payne as a game-time decision. Day'Ron Sharpe is a game-time decision as well. Ben Simmons, Cam Thomas still out for the Nets, and obviously Embiid out for the Philadelphia 76ers. Got limited markets available at the moment, but starting with these Philadelphia 76ers, we've got Tyrese Maxey. Points prop, 26.5. The matchup is a somewhat decent one, pretty good one. The Nets don't do well defending point guards. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, but only in 2 of his last 8 against Brooklyn. His assist props at 5.5. He's covered that in 4 of his last 10. Matchup's difficult. He's covered in 1 of his last 8 against the Nets. And looking at his 3-point prop, it's 2.5. Seems quite low. The Nets do allow a lot of 3-pointers made to point guards. He's covered in 5 of his last 10 games. But check this out. Against the Nets, he's covered this in 6 out of his last 8. So Tyrese Maxey, 3-point prop. That could be on. My God, I've got such a long list here. Maxey 3-pointers made. So I'll dive in a little bit further. I'll look at more matchups. I'll look at minutes and shot attempts and stuff. But Tyrese Maxey 3-pointers made. That doesn't seem too bad. Buddy Hield, his points props at 12.5, and rightly so. He's been on the decline. I think this is where the line will stay for the remainder of the season. The matchup's not overly difficult, but not easy either. But 7 of his last 10 he's hit this on. Assist-wise, the line was at 3.5. It's been at 3.5 the whole time. He tends to hit this very early in the games. If he doesn't hit this in the first quarter, you're screwed. He's covered this in 9 out of his last 10 games, but the matchup here is a difficult one, so I wouldn't consider taking it right now. 3-pointers made, his line is at 2.5. He's covered this in 9 out of his last 10 games. Looking at his attempts, he's attempting 8.7 shots per game. His percentages are down, especially over his last 5 games. Check this out. 7.6 attempts, he's only shooting at 37%, but with that volume, he's been making 3, but he hasn't been going any higher than that. The matchup against the Nets is not the easiest one. It's not a difficult one either. I'd obviously lean to the over here for Buddy Hield, but I'd like to see some more amazing numbers from him. Then we've got Tobias Harris. He had another great game the other day. Still inconsistent as fuck, though. Look at that. 31 and 28 points back-to-back. He's covered this line in 3 out of his last 10 games. He's playing the 4 in this one, so difficult matchup against the Brooklyn Nets. Dorian Finney-Smith, very capable defender, could make life hell for Tobias. He has covered in 4 out of his last 8 games against the Nets, though, so that's not too bad. His rebound prop, 6.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. Tough matchup, but he's covered in 3 out of his last 8. Jumping into these Brooklyn Nets. So Mikal Bridges, I said I'd lean to the under, and of course he went under, and it was a very sweat-free bet, only 14 points. So up against the Philadelphia 76ers. I wonder who's going to defend him. Tyrese Maxey playing the 2 in this game. He should have the size advantage no matter who defends him, but he's covered this in 2 out of his last 10 games, and against them, he's covered in 4 out of his last 8. So that's honestly not too bad. Assist 3.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. Does have a good matchup, and he covered in 3 out of his last 8 as well. He doesn't make enough 3-pointers for me to want to bet on him, but 5 of his last 10 and 3 of his last 8 against this opponent. Nick Claxton, he actually had a big game today. I saw a few people betting his unders, and I get it. I'd bet his unders too based on the form, but he went off today against the Memphis Grizzlies, scoring 21 points, had a shit ton of rebounds as well. So he does have a good matchup here. He's covered this in 2 out of his last 10, but only in 3 of his last 9 against the 76ers. And looking at his rebound prop, 10.5. Covered in 2 out of his last 10. Had 15 rebounds the last time he played Philly. I'd check this to see if Joel Embiid was playing in those games, but let's actually check it right now. Joel Embiid, where you at, my boy? No, actually, that's games with. My bad. I got this all fucked up. So I'll dive into that a little bit further, but yeah, I'm on the fence on Nick Claxton, to be honest. He's inconsistent as hell. But yeah, from this particular game, I'd say Tyrese Maxey 3-pointers. They probably interest me the most. Nothing else I really like about it. So let's jump into the next one. It's the San Antonio Spurs versus the Houston Rockets. Victor Wembanyama is a game time decision in this one. So no other props available for the Spurs. What's Victor suffering from? He's got a left shoulder strain. So that's not good. I wouldn't even put, if he was a game time decision, just rule him out straight away, to be honest. Make life easier for all the sports bettors and the sports books as well. But Victor, his points props 23.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. He struggled in every game against the Houston Rockets. Looking at his assist prop, it's 4.5. The matchup difficult. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. Struggled against the Rockets, went under in both games. Jumping into his rebound prop, it's 11.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. But he's rebounded very well against the Rockets, 12 and then 18 rebounds. Looking at his blocks, lines at 3.5. 7 of his last 10 games, 6 consecutive games in a row, he's covered his blocks line. He had 5 rebounds, 5 blocks, the last time he versed the Rockets. But I would personally be looking to take his under in points plus assists. Reason being, the matchup is somewhat difficult for both of these. I know he's covered in 5 of his last 10, but he has struggled against the Houston Rockets. And if he does have a shoulder injury, he could potentially play limited minutes or be somewhat put off for that. There is 0 reason to play him if he is injured. So, yeah, I'd definitely be taking the under in Victor Wembanyama points plus assists. So I'm going to take note of that one too. God damn, this list is long. Wemby, PA unders. Looking to you a little bit later, my man. Jumping into these Houston Rockets, though. Fred VanVleet. His points prop, 16.5. He's been playing quite well lately. We did back his overs against the Phoenix Suns, and he's been treating us quite well. Does have a good matchup here against the Spurs. He's hit in 4 of his last 10, scored 24 and 16 points in his 2 games against the Spurs. His assist prop at 7.5. 2 out of his last 10 games against the Spurs, 1 out of 2. His 3-pointers made prop, lines at 2.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. The matchup's not a bad one, and he's covered in 1 of his last 2 against them. And his rebound prop, 3.5's the line, quite low. He's covered in 4 of his last 10, and he's rebounded quite well against the Spurs in the last 2 games. But not really feeling Fred too much in this one. Jalen Green. Now, this guy's been playing quite well. Well, he did against Phoenix, right? 34 points in 2 consecutive games for Jalen Green. Another good matchup here against the Spurs, but he's only covered in 2 out of his last 6 games against the Spurs. Looking at his assists, the line's at 3.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, 2 out of his last 6 against the Spurs, and his 3-pointers made. The line's at 2.5. It's plus money. He absolutely lit the Suns up with 7 and 6 3-pointers made. Does have a good matchup here, but he's only covered in 1 of his last 6 against the Spurs. Looking at his attempts, he's averaging 4.3 attempts per game. In his last 5, he's averaging almost 10. But against the Suns, 17 and then 12 attempts from downtown from Jalen Green. So if he puts up 10 3-pointers against the Spurs, whether or not, I'd seriously consider taking a 3-point prop for him. But I don't know, maybe it's a Phoenix Suns thing. Who else have we got? Jabari Smith Jr. Oh my God, I was stumped to bet on his rebound prop. Like that was one of the most casual things I've done for quite some time. Obviously, he had these great games rebounding the ball. A lot of people are like, yeah, take his rebounds. And then if everybody's saying, yeah, take the bet, then I think it's the dumbest thing you could do. But I'm probably dumber than a regular person because I always seem to find myself betting the most popular picks that anybody could find. And most of the time, they absolutely kick my ass. So Jabari Smith Jr., though, his points prop is at 15.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. Somewhat difficult matchup against the Spurs in this one. And he's gone under in 5 consecutive games against them. So, yeah, I'd lean to the under on that for sure. Looking at his rebound prop, it's at 9.5, of course. Had 5 rebounds last time against the Suns. Difficult matchup. 7 out of his last 10 he's covered. And he did have 12 rebounds the last time these guys played. So, Jabari Smith Jr., I'd probably just take lean the under on points. Other than that, I'm not betting on him. Who else have we got? Delon Brooks. I know you pronounce it Dylan, but this guy's a villain, my friend. Line's at 12.5. He's gone under in 3 straight. The matchup against the Spurs is somewhat difficult, believe it or not. And in head-to-head matchups, he's gone over in 1 of 2. So, yeah, very up and down. If you want to look at his three-pointers, the line's at 1.5. The matchup is a difficult one. He's gone under both times against the Spurs. And the volume, it's there. 6 attempts per game. He's just not shooting them very well. He's down to 38% over his last 10. Jumping into the next one, it's the Dallas Mavericks versus the Indiana Pacers. Naismith Jr. is a game-time decision, as well as Luka Doncic, Derek Jones Jr., Maxi Kleber, game-time decisions as well. So hopefully Luka's playing in this game. It could be a very entertaining one, this one, given the pace of both teams. But let's start with these Dallas Mavericks. Luka Doncic first. He is amazing. That's what I'll say to start things off. Points prop, 34.5. He has covered in 5 out of his last 10 games, though. And against the Pacers, he's gone under in 2 out of his last 3. So there's an interesting one for you. Sticking on the points side of things, we'll look at his 3-point prop. The line here is 3.5. The Pacers do not allow many 3-pointers at all, but he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. And believe it or not, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. So he went under his points prop in both of these games, but he still managed to cover his 3-point prop. So that's a very interesting insight. Looking at his assists, though, the line is at 10.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games. The Indiana Pacers allow the fewest assists to point guards on this season. And in head-to-head matchups, Luka has got 6 assists in 3 consecutive games against the Pacers. So they're more than likely to let him score than they are to let him create. And they do run teams off the 3-point line as well. So unless Derek Lively's catching 8 lobs in this game, chances are Luka goes under his assist prop. So I'd probably lean to the under in that one. Looking at his rebound prop, it's 8.5. The matchup's not overly difficult, and Luka's covered this in 7 out of his last 10. Against the Pacers, he's gone under in 3 consecutive games. So that's quite interesting. For Luka, I'd probably lean to the over in his points and the under in his assists, to be honest. But I'll look a little bit further into that one because Luka's a man. But I can just find myself, if I do the under in his assists, I'm just going to be sweating the whole time because he can rack them up real quick. But very similar to points, right? So Kyrie Irving, let's check out my boy Kyrie. His point sign, 27.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. The matchup's not a difficult one against the Pacers. And Kyrie scored 29 points when they played just last week. And prior to that, he went under in 2 straight. His 3-point prop, the line's at 2.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10. But again, the Pacers don't allow too many 3-pointers. Kyrie did 3 assists the last time they played them, though. He's a rebound prop. Line's at 4.5. He's covered this in 8 of his last 10. He's got a difficult matchup, but he had 6 rebounds against the Pacers last time. So Kyrie, I wish I could bet on you, but yeah, not really feeling that. Josh Green, he sucks. He can't make wide open shots. Derek Lively, his points prop's only 6.5. I think last time I took the bet on him, it was 7.5. And fair enough. He only finished on 4. He had more fouls than points in that game against Philly, but against the Pacers, it's a difficult matchup to score on. He only scored 4 points when they played the Pacers last time. So Lively points, not feeling. Rebound-wise, line's at 5.5. Difficult matchup. I don't like what I'm seeing here. He only had 3 rebounds against them last time. So fade Lively is what I'm thinking. PJ Washington, he's surely got a great matchup here. The Pacers are the 5th most points to power forwards on the season. PJ's hit this in 3 out of his last 10 games, though. And he only scored 2 points when he played against the Indiana Pacers last week. He still played 30 minutes and he shot 1 from 6. So not liking what I'm seeing out of PJ. So looking at all these Dallas Mavericks, yeah, probably the Luka play. Overs in points and assists is what I would be thinking. You could probably do an alternate line for both, to be honest. Indiana, Tyrese Halliburton will start there. His points prop, 18.5. The Mavs do allow a lot of points overall, but they allow the 8th fewest points to point guards on the season. Hallie's gone under in 5 consecutive games, and against the Mavs, he scored 32 and 17 points in his last 2 outings. His 3-point prop lines at 2.5. 5 out of his last 10 games. The Mavs don't allow many 3-pointers to point guards, and Hallie has struggled against them in the past. So lines at 2.5, though. If you look at the under 2.5, you get it for plus 130. But again, that's a bit of a clinch because this man still going to take him. He's taken 7 3-pointers per game. He's on a streak of 12 consecutive misses from deep, though. So could lean to the under there for Tyrese Halliburton. His assist prop, 10.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. The Mavs do allow some assists, but Halliburton struggled against the Mavs in the past, gone under in 2 consecutive games. So look, you can probably take the under in his points plus assists. The line's at 29.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10 and 6 out of his last 20. But you know my opinion on unders. I think there's a better chance of hitting them, but the experience ain't great. Pascal Siakam, I think he would have a good matchup in this one. He does. His line's at 21.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. Scored only 12 points against Dallas when they last played. His assists, 3.5. 4 out of his last 10. Good matchup, but only had 2 assists against Dallas. And rebounds, 6.5. 5 out of his last 10. Good matchup, and had 9 rebounds against the Mavericks last time. So small sample size for Pascal Siakam. Tough man to bet on these days since he joined the Pacers. That sucks. Who else do we have? I would say Miles Turner. So been betting on Miles Turner a fair bit. The matchup's not an easy one against the Mavericks. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10, but he's killed the Mavs. He scored 33 points the last time they played, 24 points prior to that. In that game, he only played about 30 minutes. He shot 10 for 15 in the game prior to that, 10 from 13. So Miles Turner has had some good games against the Mavericks. Looking at his 3-pointers made, his line's 1.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. Despite the strong games against the Mavs, he's only hit this in 1 of 2. Attempting a lot of 3-pointers, just not knocking him down. So he must have been doing a lot of work inside the paint. Rebounds, lines at 7.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games, and he had 8 rebounds the last time they matched up, and 7 rebounds prior to that. So for Miles Turner, I'd probably say the points prop is what I like the most. But in this game, I'd say, yeah, Luka points, under an assist perhaps. Jumping into the last game, and this is sure to be a good one. It's the Phoenix Suns versus the Denver Nuggets. Yusuf Nurkic, game time decision again with his neck spasms. How about the rebounds he got? What an absolute freak. Devin Booker is still out. The Denver Nuggets pretty much full strength. Lines for the Suns are only available on Bradley Beal and Kevin Durant at the moment. I'm sure we'll be waiting on a Nurkic status. But starting with Bradley Beal. So Bradley Beal starting at point guard. I wonder how that's going to go. He did score 31 points last time against the OKC Thunder. So he's covered 19.5 in 4 out of his last 10. He's yet to verse the Denver Nuggets. The matchup for point guards is difficult, though. His assist line, 4.5, despite playing point guard in this game. 7 out of his last 10 games. You might want to look at his games without Devin Booker. We can see he's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games without D-Book. Points-wise, without Book. Let's have a look. That rhymed, and I didn't mean it to. 6 out of his last 10 games without Devin Booker. He's gone over. I think what might be worth looking at is just his PRA. So he's covered his PRA of 27.5 in 6 out of his last 10 games. You remove D-Book out of the equation, and that goes up to 7 out of his last 10. 4 consecutive games he's covered his PRA. So, yeah, it's not a bad play for Bradley Beal, I guess. But, you know, that matchup against Denver is hard for him. And the Nuggets are 9-point favorites in this game. So a chance for a blowout here. I'm not overly keen on it, but let's have a look at Kevin Durant. His points props at 27.5, 4 out of his last 10. Against the Nuggets, he's covered in 6 out of his last 9. So he's gave him a good run without Book. So I wonder if he's played against them. 6 out of his last 10 games without Book, he's covered. He's played 1 game against the Nuggets without Devin Booker, and he scored 30 points. So that's not too bad. 3-pointers made, not worth it for KD. Doesn't take many of those. Assists, though, line is at 4.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. And he's covered in 5 consecutive games against the Denver Nuggets. So that's interesting. There's a bit of playoff action in there, I believe. But let's look at his last 10 games without Devin Booker. See if there's an improvement in his assist numbers. 7 out of his last 10 games without Book, he's covered. So it's not the worst thing in the world. And if we look at his rebound prop, the line is 6.5. Money, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. Not too bad. When you head-to-head numbers, he has gone under in his 2 straight. These games where he's putting things together, I believe these are all playoff games too. So I wouldn't factor that form into it. We're betting on the regular season here. Looking at these Denver Nuggets, we'll start with Jamal Murray. So his points prop, 21.5. The matchup against the Phoenix Suns, I believe it's a good one. They do allow a lot of points to point guards. He has covered in 4 of 10. Head-to-head matchups, his last 8, but 3 of his last 4. His 3-point prop in this game is 2.5. The Suns do allow a lot of 3-pointers made to point guards, but he's only covered in 3 of his last 8 against them. And in his last 10 games, 5 of his last 10. So Jamal Murray, quite inconsistent. You got to find the perfect matchup for him. Even looking at his assists, he's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, but only 3 of his last 8 against the Phoenix Suns. So not really feeling that. Let's look at MPJ. We'll look at his points, rebounds, and 3-pointers. His points prop, 16.5. Tough matchup here against the Suns. He's covered in 6 of his last 10 on pretty good form. 30 against Miami, 25 against the Lakers. But against the Phoenix Suns, he's covered in 3 out of his last 9. So that's not great. Looking at his 3-point prop, it's 2.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup, and he's only covered in 2 of 9 games against the Suns. Rebound-wise, matchup's difficult as well, but he has covered in 5 of his last 9 against Phoenix, and in his last 10, he's covered this in 5 of his last 10. So, yeah, I'm not loving that. Aaron Gordon, I know his last 5 games he's been pretty decent. Line's at 14.5. Yeah, he has. He's covered in 4 of his last 5, 6 out of his last 10. The matchup is somewhat decent against Phoenix. And against them, though, he's gone under in 4 consecutive games. Out of curiosity, I wanted to see what the odds were for 1 3-pointer. It's not too bad, but he don't shoot many of those. Rebound-wise, line's at 6.5, 4 of his last 10, and 3 of his last 9 against the Suns. So, yeah, not really feeling that. Haven't made a bet on Nikola Jokic for quite some time, so maybe this could be today. His points prop, 26.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Matchup is a difficult one, but if Nurkic doesn't play, it gets a little bit easier. 4 out of his last 10, and he's covered in 6 of his last 9 against the Suns. Looking at his assist prop, 5 out of his last 10, he's covered 8.5. The matchup is a good one against the Suns, and he's gone over this in 5 consecutive games against Phoenix. So that's overly impressive. Had 16 assists in a win against them in December. So I don't mind that for Nikola Jokic. And rebound-wise, what are we looking at? 12.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10 games and in 6 of his last 9 games against Phoenix. Although last 2 games he's played against them, he has gone under. So, yeah, Nikola Jokic assists, probably the one I'd like the most out of this game. But yeah, for most of these others, I'm not really feeling it. I'm just going to tell you. So I thought I got through that quite quickly. Managed to include some 3-point markets. It's just over an hour, so I'm pretty chuffed and pretty happy with how that all went. I did want to get your opinion, though. And I'll be asking for your opinion. I'll make pretty much a slot in every single video where I can get some thoughts from you. But I'm forward planning to what do I do after the NBA season. Obviously, a lot of you guys have jumped on over the past few months, and this channel has really started to blow up. So shout out to you all who have subscribed. 4,000, baby. But I'm planning things out as to what do I do after the NBA season finishes. Obviously, I'll be betting and I'll be creating content on the NRL, which is rugby league, but that's a sport mainly only played in Australia. We did have the opener in Vegas. Hopefully, you guys had a chance to watch it. And if that does interest you, I'll obviously keep creating NRL content, but I want to get your opinion, your feedback. when the NBA is done, what type of content would you like to see? I obviously have access to a lot of tools. My methods of research and analytics, they're pretty much applicable to all sports. You let me know what type of content you'd like to see after the NBA season, and I can spend some time preparing on it to make sure I can continue to deliver, because my favorite part about this whole thing is the research, finding the plays, understanding the why, and then when they win, I feel like an absolute god, right? Because I'm not relying on anybody to give me these picks. I like doing all the work myself and figuring out how to win. So if that sounds interesting, just let me know in the comment section. What should I look into once this NBA season finishes? Other than that, if you want to see more content from yours truly, click on this video up here. If not, wait till the next video, because you know when it's coming. It's coming tomorrow. So I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!
To the channel, cause your boy's getting busy. Coming to you live from the west side of Sydney. We've got the free picks and the juice on the daily. It's all free, you don't even have to pay me.